Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Aditya, and I'm joined today by Pranav and Satyanath. Pranav, is this your second time on the podcast since you returned to Takshashila?
It's my third time.
Oh, awesome. Okay. Well, the last time you and I spoke, if I recall, was when we had discussed the May meeting of the UN's open-ended working group on space threats. And now, Pranav, you've actually completed a Takshashila discussion document on the subject, and we'll provide a link to that document in the show notes. And I highly recommend you check it out if you're interested in either strategic affairs or its space. But today, Pranav and I want to talk about something a little more quirky. Specifically, we want to talk about the evolution of kinetic kill vehicles or exoatmospheric kill vehicles. Now, for more than half a century, people have been devising and fielding space weapons that are launched from Earth, go into space and destroy another object in space. Now, humans have also sought to develop such kill vehicles that we launch from space to attack other space objects. So those quite haven't come into fruition. Now, in the beginning, more than 50 years back, these weapons were often nuclear tipped. They would fly in the general vicinity of a space object and explode, or at least that was the idea. Of late, kill vehicles carry no explosives. They use the kinetic energy of impact to create destruction, hence the name kinetic kill vehicles. And one reason, of course, to not have explosives there is simply because of the massive collateral damage it would create to your own space capabilities and those of others. But what are the targets of these kill vehicles? Well, they can be both orbital and non-orbital. When they were first created, these were essentially all about long-range missiles, especially ICBMs and their warheads. The orbital targets are, of course, satellites and also possibly space stations. And, of late, we've seen an explosion, if you pardon the pun, an explosion of these type of kill vehicles in the last 15 years, because there's been a renaissance in anti-satellite missiles, beginning with the Chinese test in 2007. What we'll try and do with this episode is that Pranav and I will try and place these kill vehicles in the broader context of international politics. So it's really fitting that we are talking about kill vehicles now in 2022, because it was 50 years back in 1972 that the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty came into effect. And it was 20 years ago, after 30 years of the treaty being in effect, that it was actually abrogated after the US withdrew from the treaty under the administration of George W. Bush. This happened in the shadow of 9/11. So what we've seen since then is really the changing political and technological context, creating new avenues for these kill vehicles to come into being. And these do have impinge upon international politics. So what we'll do is we'll look at the evolution of kill vehicles over the last 50 years and what prospects they hold for international politics in the coming decade. With that long introduction, Pranav, I was wondering, since you're the one who's done a lot of extensive reading on this, can you just walk us through the beginnings of the efforts at trying to limit these kill vehicles, starting really with the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972? Obviously this was part of, the détente between the superpowers, the SALT Treaty. How did the ABM come about and what were its effects?
Before we go into the history of the ABM treaty, because we're talking about kinetic kill vehicles and their role in international politics, we have to first understand that kill vehicles are, in the grander scheme of things, relatively new technologies. Even when the ABM treaty was signed in 1972, kinetic kill vehicle was considered to be this super advanced technology that was very, very difficult to attain. It was only in the late 1970s and early 1980s that people started to think long and hard about how do we incorporate technologies that don't use nuclear warheads. So before the 1970s, and what we essentially had was nuclear interceptors, ballistic missile interceptors with nuclear warheads at the pointy end, because there was no other way to intercept missiles. The attempt was, how do we protect our homeland from Soviet incoming missiles? And in the Soviet Union, it was how do we protect our homeland, whether it's cities or whether it's missile sites from American missiles. So in the early years, we had something called Nike's. In the 1960s, the Americans were testing something called a Nike Zeus, and Nike Zeus was this medium-range missile with a nuclear warhead at the end. Unfortunately, this missile was too primitive to intercept even the early age ballistic missiles, because in the early ages we did not have multiple re-entry vehicles, and it was still very primitive technology. And then the scale of the program was toned down. Initially, the homeland defense was to protect cities, but they realized that protecting cities against a growing Soviet arsenal was very difficult. And the program was scaled back to protecting missile sites, missile launch sites against so called Chinese threats, even though China had a very, very primitive arsenal. It was completely political. The Americans wanted to keep the ABM technology running, even while they knew that it was futile against the Soviet Union. And the Soviets themselves also realized this, because the Soviet technology was also very primitive. So it evolved into something called a Sentinel, and then we got a Safeguard, a ballistic missile system in the ballistic missile defense system in the United States. And finally, the United States and the Soviet Union came to an agreement that they would limit their ABM sites to. The Americans chose to protect their missile launch sites, while the Soviet Union chose to protect their cities. This was how the program evolved. In 1974, they signed a protocol where they decided to restrict ABM deployment to only one site. In the United States, this was a very political move. The American citizens didn't really like having a nuclear tipped missile in their backyard, because a lot of the missile launch sites were located behind cities and in the countryside. So ultimately, the Americans eliminated all their nuclear armed ABMs, while the Soviet kept their Galosh, or the Moscow missile defense system, which is still in operation, right? So what we have was kinetic kill vehicles was not really a thing, and atmospheric testing was banned under the Limited Test Ban Treaty of August 1963. So it was soon realized that they needed better technology to intercept ballistic missiles rather than rely on nuclear warheads to blast out incoming missiles, right? So this established the case for finding new technologies, which ultimately led to the kinetic kill vehicles and attempts to circumvent the ABM treaty.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Pranav. And it's also important, like you pointed out, to note that there were also legal limitations on the ability to use nuclear explosions, like you pointed out, the Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963, as well as the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, basically made it hard to justify either setting off nuclear explosions in space or parking nuclear weapons in space. What's also interesting, I think, is what happened after the ABM Treaty was signed. The 1970s are often called the decade of the MERV revolution, basically. Whether rightly or wrongly, that was the time when multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles became standard on most ICBMs and then SLBMs in both the Soviet and the American arsenals. And obviously, one of the purposes of having MERVs is that because there are so many of them, you can potentially defeat anti-ballistic missile technologies, and especially kinetic anti-ballistic missile technologies. Now, what's also interesting about the 70s is, so if you've noticed the treaties we've talked about until now, starting with the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 63, all the way up to the Biological Weapons Convention by 1975, with SALT and the ABM Treaty in between 1972. What's really interesting is that this is the period of the detente. This is the period where the two superpowers are talking to each other and coming up with these mutually agreed upon limitations on their arsenals. By the 70s, the late 70s, some of that steam starts to go out. And the US and the Soviets actually enter into negotiations in 1978-79 on a potential treaty on anti-satellite weapons, because this is the time when kinetic kill technology starts to be considered. And those treaties and those talks eventually go nowhere. Part of the reason for this is simply politics. December 1979 was when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and period of detente was over, and you would have a period of high tension in the Cold War from 1979 to 1985 when Gorbachev came to power. And this is a time when it becomes really difficult to negotiate something on ASATs. The other factor was simply there were other arms control priorities, in particular, negotiating what would eventually become the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty that was signed in December 1987. So, there were simply other things that the two superpowers would rather focus on. And it was in this period, really, that you saw some of the first ASAT tests of the sort that we think of when we talk about ASATs today. So, This is the time when the Americans started testing their air-launched miniature vehicles, which were these two-stage missiles that were launched from an F-15 aircraft at high altitude. These missiles would then enter into the outer atmosphere in space and eventually target a satellite in low Earth orbit. So, these were some of the first kinetic kill or hit to kill ASATs that were tested and validated. This was followed by several other tests by the US. The US had the Miracle program, the KE ASAT program, and the Soviets had their own program. And these tests basically continued until 1985 during this period of renewed tension in the Cold War. And in 1985, effectively, there was a moratorium that came into place. This was informal, but it remained in place, and there were no more destructive tests between 1985 and 2007. And we'll get to 2007 in a bit, but it's really interesting to see that how that period of arms control comes to an end. And you see, that has an effect on kinetic kill vehicles and their development. It actually opens up the space for them to be validated and to become potential weapons of war. Now, we cannot talk about the early 80s without talking about that 64,000-pound gorilla, chimpanzee, giant monster in the room called SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, so-called Star Wars program that Reagan announced in 1983. Pranav, among other things, of course, SDI was meant to make nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete, as Reagan said. But one of the interesting parts of the SDI program that is directly relevant to us is brilliant pebbles. Can you just talk about them? Because this is, basically, this is an idea that never goes away, right?
Yeah, it's an idea that never goes away. And what you mentioned is extremely interesting. In the 1970s, ASAT suddenly came about. The Americans were suddenly thinking about using miniature homing vehicles to target satellites. And this is also highly correlated to the time when kinetic kill vehicles started to come about. The Americans and the Soviets, in fact, had two very different approaches to ASAT development. The Soviets had a co-orbital ASAT program called the IS. I will not butcher the Russian pronunciation, so I'll call it the IS program. The IS program was a co-orbital ASAT test where they had a small explosive, and once the satellite was close by, it would create shrapnel in almost all directions, and it was supposed to destroy satellites. The Americans, because they had a very good missile defense technology and anti-ballistic missile technology, they were able to utilize a lot of these technologies to build better kinetic kill vehicles for intercepting satellites. Even though this did not result in a ground-based launcher, it created the groundwork or a foundation for future programs. It was only in the 1980s when the Soviets started to think about putting kinetic kill vehicles on missiles. For example, the Breeze. The Breeze was a name given to a kinetic kill vehicle that would be placed on a universal rocket of the Soviet Union. And this was this was supposed to be the extremely high altitude ASAT weapon, which was never deployed or tested. But in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan suddenly had this idea that we should shake up the concept of deterrence. Mutual vulnerability was something that was very unsettling and very uneasy. And Strategic Defense Initiative was supposed to utilize America's best technology in lasers and microchips and computers to create a defense system that would basically wipe out any incoming ballistic missile, either from the Soviet Union or China or even North Korea or Iran. It initially, when it was proposed, it was supposed to have lasers. It was supposed to have space-based missiles, these tiny missiles which would fly, and the concept was all over the place. But by the end of the 1980s, when the Soviets and the Americans finally toned it down and they decided to forge agreements like the Intermediate Range Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, and the START 1. The START 1 created massive reductions. This was around the time when also the Brilliant Pebbles came about. Brilliant Pebbles is a space-based interceptor concept where you would launch a mega satellite sort of thing, which would carry smaller interceptors. And this would be coupled with something called the Brilliant Eyes, which was a satellite constellation system which would detect incoming missiles. And these systems would work all in tandem so that when a Soviet missile or any other enemy missile was launched, you would have an interceptor at any given time in space that would launch and destroy the missile that was going towards the United States. The concept was far too ambitious for its time. The cost was enormous because they could not launch a satellite constellation. Given the launch technology at the time, they did not have reusable rockets. They did not have microsatellites or nanosatellites. So they had to use these massive bus-sized satellites. They had all these problems going for it. But what they got right was the kinetic kill technology, the technology where you would not use nuclear warheads to destroy incoming missiles, but you would use these kinetic kill technology. And the brilliant pebbles had this technology where they would use a kinetic kill vehicle that had a smaller set of kinetic explosives, or not explosives exactly, a smaller set of materials that would basically detach and create a dust cloud of metal, and a missile passing through this dust cloud would basically get destroyed, right? So in the 1970s, we had something called the Homing Overlay Experimental Vehicle, or HO. This was in the early 1970s. It was in 1977 when they began this experiment, and this was supposed to be early years of the kinetic kill vehicle. This evolved to something called as the Exo-Atmospheric Re-Entry Interceptor System, ERSI. Why am I talking about all this is because it here really lays the groundwork of what came
Sorry, it's Eris. It's Eris, not
ERIS,
Eris.
something called the Exo-Atmospheric Re-Entry Interceptor System, or ERIS. Why I'm talking about all this is because these technologies really lay the groundwork for what was to come in the future and what we have today. And finally, there was something called as the Lightweight Exo-Atmospheric Project, or LEAP. And LEAP was really the technology that gave rise to the ground-based interceptor, which we have today. So in the 1990s, Brilliant Pebbles, even though the program was shut down because it was far too expensive, there was these group of scientists and there were these advocates within the Congress who were very, very much obsessed with keeping the knowledge and transferring this knowledge somehow to future American ballistic missile systems. And it ultimately led to the aberration of the ABM treaty in the 1990s because the North Korean missile program was improving. Many in the Clinton administration were pushing for theater missile defenses. In 1994 and 1995, the Russians and the Americans actually agreed to a demarcation agreement for the ABM treaty, where they would differentiate between theater missiles and strategic defenses. This was one of the agreements that would have really saved the ABM treaty, but the Americans weren't ready to accept it. And by the 1990s, many in the Congress and the scientific community and the defense community had already established something called global protection against limited strikes. And this was where the ground-based interceptor, or GBI, the missile defense, the mid-course system that the US has today, was laid down. And they wanted about 200 to 500 interceptors that would be placed on ground that would intercept either Russian missiles or North Korean missiles.
Yeah, absolutely. Pranav, you've done a stellar job of actually recounting several decades of development. And, we want to bring it right up to the present. You've talked about the GBI. And of course, the GBI has to be understood in the context of the end of the ABM treaty. And we'll talk about that and what the future holds after a very quick break. Welcome back to All Things Policy. We're talking kinetic kill vehicles and how they fit into the broader framework of arms control, of nuclear weapons, of space technologies, and of international politics. Pranav, you have talked about the ground-based interceptor program the US has. And of course, this came about this was possible precisely because the US, after 30 years, exited the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002. This came right after 9/11 under the administration of George W. Bush. And one of the key reasons that was actually cited for this was that, it would give the US the opportunity to develop ballistic missile defenses to intercept missiles launched by rogue states. And this was an idea that had a lot of currents in the aftermath of 9/11. I'm not sure if it was a completely honest argument right there. I think there were other motivations. One motivation that they did talk about was simply that technology had changed. The sensor and guidance revolution allowed for potentially far more effective missile defense. Can you talk about what the abrogation of the treaty meant for the evolution of kinetic kill vehicles?
The downfall of the ABM treaty itself led to a cascade of events because the ABM treaty within the Soviet Union and Russia and even for China was viewed as this agreement that sort of set in stone the idea of mutual vulnerability, that no side could defend itself or gain an advantage to strike first. And pulling out of the ABM treaty essentially killed this idea because the US felt that it could defend itself. It could survive a first strike, or it could gain an advantage with missile defenses. so that it could launch a counterforce attack on its adversary, right? It essentially it essentially brought down so many years of arms control work. And because, for positive or for it might not be the right reasons, but the Russians and the Chinese have continuously, since America pulled out of the ABM treaty, have expressed a mistrust of American missile defense system. And they have used that as a pretext to develop advanced systems like hypersonic vehicles, right? So one of the biggest political effects is that it led to the crash of every other arms control agreement. One could argue that a New START was a completely new agreement, but New START, as an ambitious arms control agreement, was much, much smaller in scale compared to what the Reagan administration had crafted, and the Bush administration ultimately, the first Bush administration, ultimately negotiated, right? Ultimately negotiated and signed. So that was the ABM treaty and what it stood for. But once the ABM treaty was pulled out, we had all the scientific community, defense community, who had worked for years on kinetic kill vehicles, that they were ready to deploy this technology. So in 2002, the George W. Bush administration had to prove something because they had pulled out. They had to prove that they had some bit of capability, and they started deploying the ground-based interceptor, also known as the ground-based mid-course interceptor, because this is supposed to intercept an incoming ballistic missile during the mid-course phase of its trajectory. And what they did was they had this plan where they had something called a phased adaptive approach. That is, instead of having a completely ready to deploy missile, you would deploy the defense system first, and you would go about improving it over the years. One of the major critiques of the GBI is that it is completely ineffective. Forget ineffective against MIRVs, it can't even protect against simple countermeasures. And the counter argument is that no, the GBI is still very useful. It's just that we have to deploy these improvements over the years, and which led to something known as now the GBI has something called as the exo-atmospheric kill vehicle, which is a kinetic kill vehicle developed in the early 2000s or late 1990s, which was developed, which was incorporated into the GBI. And after that, there have been several attempts to get a new kinetic kill vehicle, one of which has something been called a multiple object kill vehicle. The funding for this project started in 2005 under the George W. Bush administration. It lost funding midway. They tried to gain funding again in 2012, but by 2019, the funds had dried up and had nothing to show for. So you see that it's become a sunk cost. The GBI, when the Bush administration pulled out and it deployed this very primitive capability, they thought that they could improve this technology rapidly within 5 to 10 years. Unfortunately, that has not been possible because of the political debates around the GBI and the funding. And every now and then, the program runs out of funding. And they have deployed only 44 interceptors. For the planned 250 interceptors, they've not even reached close. They have only 44 interceptors and they have to deploy 20 more by 2023. But given the funding that the program has received, we will not see new deployments till 2025, 2026. So the program has really taken a step back because of the very, very unplanned way in which, or very, very ad hoc planning, which has shaped the the missile defense system of the US, particularly the ground-based missile defense. If you look at the theater missile defenses such as THAAD, they have seen much, much better prospects. They have shown for the money that they've put in. But the mid-course interceptor, which is supposed to be the backbone of US missile defense, has performed very poorly because of how the program itself was developed. It was not derived by any scientific method, but more driven by political ambition and parochial interests within the Department of Defense.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that the ground-based mid-course interceptor has much about it to criticize. And of course, those who defend it would say that, well, you set it up for failure because, as you pointed out, funding is so erratic. It's really hard for these technologies to evolve. There's no certainty about whether you get the budgets that you need next year or the year after that. And so these programs have basically been set up to fail. I'm not sure how far. I think the point has some validity in it, but there are still, I think, basic issues of feasibility that, especially something like the mid-course interceptors have to answer for. Pranav, you talked about, for example, multi-object kill vehicles and, the RKV or redesigned kill vehicle technology in which they're supposed to be based. Like, it's not just one reason they failed is not just because one reason they fail is not just because funding is erratic, but because they're trying to solve a really difficult problem. I mean, the reason that you have a multi-object kill vehicle or previously a multi-kill vehicle program is precisely because of the merving and as well as the decoys that you talked about, Pranav. So the decoys are typically Midar balloons. And the idea of something like a multi-object kill vehicle was to actually go and attack many of these, both the MIRVs and balloons. And, balloons would pop, MIRVs would be damaged or destroyed. They're an attempt, a really ambitious attempt to solve a very difficult problem. And it's not clear that even if there was regular funding, that we're going to see some massive new revolution in the capabilities of missile defenses, even if you have space-based missile defenses, because as Pranav pointed out, yes, of course, launch costs and everything have massively plummeted, and you have much better sensors and guidance today than you had, say, 1980s. But it's just very hard to have a constellation of satellites that provides you the kind of coverage that you need because, ICBMs are launched not just from silos, but also mobile launchers, from submarines and so on. So, determining trajectories, where a missile is going to be when, and placing your constellations at orbit based on that are all really difficult. And of course, let's not get into how vulnerable your constellations are to other kinetic kill vehicles launched.
And it's not just that. There's also the political cost. If you're having hundreds of micro satellites that are there for the pure purpose of detecting and intercepting enemy missiles, then what is the political message that you're trying to send? You're really trying to say that we do not believe in mutual vulnerability. We want to gain first strike advantages. The political consequences of trying to defend against a handful of missiles is extremely high, and you are begging for an arms race. We already studied, we at Takshashila have written so much about ASAT development and seen in 2021, late 2021, Russia test an ASAT system at a very, very high altitude. All these problems really show that there's also a political element that is going to be very, very expensive for your country. Not monetary wise, but political cost of it is going to be very high. And it just does not make sense for you to take that risk or gaining marginal advantages.
Yeah, it is. And you're absolutely right. It's marginal advantages as of now. When we talk about kinetic kill vehicles, we're really talking about two things. One that you've discussed in great detail, which is ballistic missile defense and thence arms control. And the other is, of course, ASAT technology, the vulnerability of objects in space. And what we've seen is actually a lot of very basic ignorance about the reality of mutual vulnerability. You saw this very evidently in 2017 when North Korea started testing all its long-range missiles, including ICBMs. There was a general shock in the United States that the US was not actually sure of being able to defend itself against an ICBM. And of late with Russia in 2022, again, with the perceived Russian nuclear threats, you see again a great deal of surprise 5 years later, from the general public about this. Now, this is not the general public's fault. This is really a symptom of the failure of politicians to communicate these realities to people. And what's also fascinating about everything we've talked about right now, Pranav, is it's all a very American story. It's the Americans that develop these systems, or at least take the lead in developing them, that the Russians try and catch up. But the story of KKVs, of kinetic kill vehicles, is not going to be an American story anymore. So we keep talking about there has been this ASAT renaissance starting in 2007. You had the Chinese test in January of that year, and that destroyed that destroyed a Chinese satellite. It created some 3,000 pieces of tracked debris. The next year, the US responded with a test of its own, a modified SM-3 air defense missile, again, a ballistic missile defense missile. And then you had India in March 2019 with Mission Shakti. And as Pranav mentioned, a Russian test late last year, which intercepted a satellite at 480 kilometers above sea level. To give you perspective, the International Space Station orbits at about 400 kilometers. So that's a really high altitude test. And it obviously created a lot of dangerous debris. So what we've seen is, I think, states trying to demonstrate very clearly that they have the ability to track objects in space and launch missiles that can be guided onto these targets that are moving at incredible speeds and destroy them. And, this is really, of course, a product of the guidance sensor revolution that we talked about. And this has been democratized for better and for worse. And we're going to see a lot more states developing kinetic kill vehicles. And whether we like it or not, they're going to be in the news. And when they are, Pranav and I always find an opportunity to talk about them. Any final thoughts before we conclude, Pranav?
I think one final thought I have is just the development of space capabilities and military technology is quite fascinating, especially 1960s to 80s. The parallel, we think about the arms race, we think about a space race as the Americans winning the moon race, but the moon race was one of three moon races, right? One was the civilian space race. The second was what I call the intelligence space race, where they were trying to get better telemetry, better detection, and better spy satellites on both Soviet side and the American side. And finally was the military space program, which involves the development of kinetic kill vehicles and ASATs. Only recently, we're getting very, very rich documentation on the American side, and it's quite a fascinating history. I would, if anyone's got the chance, just go on just Google some of these things, or follow scholars like Aaron Bateman, who really are unearthing these documents by the day, and they're telling us how old these concepts are, and yet we are still pondering over them. So that's what I find very fascinating about this topic. And just going back to my archives and reading my own set of documents that I unearthed was quite fascinating. So the space for research here is enormous.
Pun intended, I assume. But yeah, Pranav, thanks. Yeah, and we'll link to Aaron Bateman's amazing set of publications on these subjects. They are absolutely wonderful reads. And of course, we'll also link to Pranav's OEWG document. So thank you so much, Pranav, for joining us. And thank you for joining us on All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.